In the middle of the dense, snow-covered mountains, there stood a small, weather-beaten log cabin. Its timbers groaned against the howling winds, and the roof sagged under the heavy weight of winter's fury. Inside, nestled by the warmth of a crackling fire, sat Bill, a man of considerable age, his features softened by years of solitude. Bill had lived alone for as long as he could remember, the years having carried away family and friends, leaving behind memories that seemed to fade with each passing day. His days were spent in quiet reflection, reading books that were once cherished by a family now long gone. His life was simple, but it was also solitary, and the silence that enveloped him often seemed to press in from all sides. The hours drifted by slowly, and sometimes, when the wind whistled through the trees and the snow piled higher, Bill would sit by the window and gaze out, hoping for something, or someone, to break the stillness of his world. It was on one of these nights, as the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, that the storm arrived. Bill had settled into his favorite chair with a well-worn book in hand, the orange glow of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The wind had started to pick up earlier in the day, and by nightfall, it had become an unrelenting force, battering against the cabin. The snow came down in thick sheets, swirling outside like a frozen sea, and the temperature had dropped so low that the very air felt sharp, like tiny needles biting at the skin. As the storm raged on, Bill did his best to focus on the words before him, though his mind often wandered. His thoughts turned to his family, his wife, his children, gone now for so many years. He remembered their laughter, their voices, the warmth of their presence. But the years had worn those memories thin, and now, they were little more than a faint echo in the back of his mind. The night was unusually still. Despite the chaos outside, the fire had mellowed to a gentle hum, and the wind seemed to howl less fiercely for a moment. It was in this eerie calm that Bill first heard it, a soft, faint sound, almost imperceptible against the wind's roar. At first, he thought it was just the storm playing tricks on him, a whisper carried on the wind. But then he heard it again, a weak, plaintive cry, as if something or someone were in distress. Bill sat up straighter, his heart skipping a beat as he strained his ears to listen more closely. The sound was unmistakable now, a whimper, followed by another, and then more, rising in volume and urgency. It came from outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the cabin's windows, buried in the white expanse of snow. Bill's eyes widened in confusion and concern. Who, or what, could be out there in the middle of this storm? He had not heard any voices or signs of life since the day before. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the noise. It was a sound he couldn't ignore, a call for help he felt deep in his bones. With his heart pounding in his chest, Bill stood from his chair, abandoning his book on the floor. He moved to the door, his hands trembling as he grasped the cold brass handle. The storm was fierce, and the thought of venturing out into the blizzard was almost more than he could bear. But something inside him stirred, something primal, urging him to open the door and investigate. He stepped out into the icy air, the wind immediately biting at his face as snowflakes stung his skin. The snow swirled around him, obscuring his vision, but he knew he had to press on. Bill took one step, then another, his boots crunching in the thick snow, the wind almost knocking him off balance. He squinted against the storm, trying to locate the source of the cries. And then he saw them. Amidst the swirling snow, huddled together for warmth, were a small group of puppies. They were shivering, their fur matted with snow, their tiny bodies trembling against the cold. Bill's heart nearly broke at the sight. How had they ended up here, in the middle of this fierce storm? There was no sign of their mother, no shelter nearby. The little creatures were alone, vulnerable, and in desperate need of help. Without a second thought, Bill rushed forward, crouching down to scoop up the fragile puppies one by one. They whimpered softly in his arms, their bodies so small and fragile that they seemed to weigh nothing at all. Bill cradled them against his chest, wrapping his coat tighter around them to protect him from the biting cold. He turned back toward the cabin, his movements slow and deliberate as he made his way through the thick snow. His breath came in short bursts, and the wind howled in his ears, but all that mattered was getting the puppies inside, to warmth and safety. The door slammed shut behind him as he hurried back inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping him like a comforting embrace. Bill gently placed the puppies by the fire, watching as they curled up together, seeking comfort in each other's presence. Their small bodies shivered, but the warmth of the fire soon began to soothe them. Bill stood over them, a sense of fulfillment settling over him that he had not felt in years. He had brought them in from the storm, given him shelter, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel so alone. As he watched the puppies, Bill's mind drifted back to the memories of his own family. He remembered the way his children's laughter filled the house, the way his wife had always known what to do in moments like this. He realized, with a pang in his heart, that he had not known what it meant to care for something in so long. These puppies, though small and fragile, had rekindled something in him, something he thought was lost. They had brought him a sense of purpose, a reason to be vigilant, a reason to keep going. For the first time in years, Bill no longer felt the weight of isolation quite so heavily. The storm still raged outside, the snow still piled high, but inside, there was warmth, there was life, and there was hope. Bill knew that, no matter what the future held, he had found something precious, something worth protecting in the heart of the storm. The storm had grown more violent with each passing minute, the winds howling like a chorus of ghosts and the snow falling in blinding sheets. The world outside Bill's cabin had become a swirling mass of white, and the cold was so fierce that it seemed to bite at his very soul. But Bill couldn't ignore the cries. They had cut through the howling wind, reaching him in his quiet solitude like a distant call for help. The sound was weak, desperate, and impossible to dismiss. His heart ached as he thought of the small, vulnerable creatures that must be suffering in the cold. And despite the raging storm, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to act. Bill paused at the door, his hand resting on the cold brass handle, his breath misting up the glass. The fire inside still crackled, casting warm light across the room. But it wasn't enough to chase away the feeling of urgency building within him. His body was tired from years of solitude, his hands stiff and aching from the cold, but his heart still held the spark of a purpose long forgotten. For years, he had lived in isolation, his world reduced to the quiet rhythm of day after day. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was something calling him to move, to step out into the storm and do something. Anything. To help. With a determined breath, Bill grabbed his flashlight from the table, its beam cutting a narrow path through the night. He pulled on his thick woolen coat, tugging the collar up to shield himself from the biting wind, and he stepped out into the fury of the blizzard. The snow hit him like a wall, blurring his vision, and the wind seemed intent on pushing him back inside. But Bill pressed on, each step a battle against the elements. His boots sank deep into the snow, making it difficult to move, and the cold pierced through him with a force that stole his breath away. Despite the ferocity of the storm, Bill moved with purpose. His heart guided him, and his mind refused to give in to the fear that gnawed at him. He could hear the faint whimpers again, now louder and more distinct. They were out there, somewhere, just beyond the reach of the light, and he would not stop until he found them. The storm had erased the world around him, leaving him in a vast, empty white space where nothing seemed real except the sound of those desperate cries. He had no idea how long he had been walking, how far he had gone, The wind whipped against his face, biting through his coat, and the snow stung his skin. But he didn't care. The cries drove him forward, and he could feel his pulse quicken with each step. His breath came in shallow bursts, the cold air burning his lungs. But he refused to turn back. His feet ached, his legs trembled, but there was something in the cries of those helpless creatures that made him move. Made him push forward against the storm. He had to find them. He couldn't leave them out here in the cold. Then, through the haze of snow and wind, Bill caught sight of something. A shape, small and barely visible against the white backdrop of the storm. He squinted, trying to focus, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the tiny figures huddled together. The puppies. There they were, struggling to stay upright in the snow, their tiny bodies shaking uncontrollably from the cold. There were 6 of them, all golden retrievers, their fur matted with snow, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were just puppies, no older than a few weeks, and they had been left out here, abandoned to the mercy of the storm. Bill's legs moved faster now, urgency propelling him forward. His hands were frozen, but he didn't care. He dropped to his knees in the snow, scooping up the first puppy he could reach. The little creature was light as a feather, its tiny body shivering in his arms, its whimpers breaking his heart. He could feel its heartbeat, rapid and frail against his chest, and he whispered softly to it, trying to comfort it as he moved to gather the others. One by one, he collected them, each one trembling in his arms, their small bodies no match for the ferocity of the storm. They were so cold, so fragile, that he feared they might slip away in his arms, lost to the cold and the darkness. Bill didn't stop to think about what he was doing or how he was going to carry them all back. All that mattered was getting them inside, where it was warm, where they could survive. He clutched the puppies to his chest, feeling the warmth of their tiny bodies against his own. His heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness, a love that seemed to spring from nowhere. And he knew that he couldn't leave them out here. He couldn't leave them to die alone in the storm. The journey back to the cabin was a blur, the snow swirling so thickly that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Bill's legs felt like lead, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But he kept moving. He could hear the faint cries of the puppies in his arms, and each one fueled his determination. He had to get them inside. He had to save them. When he finally reached the door of the cabin, his hands were stiff and raw from the cold, but he managed to turn the knob and push the door open. The warmth of the cabin enveloped him like a soft, gentle embrace, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He moved quickly, stepping over the threshold and into the safety of the cabin, where the fire still crackled and the air smelled of wood smoke. He laid the puppies down in front of the fire, one by one, watching as they huddled together for warmth. Bill stood over them for a moment, taking in the sight of these tiny creatures, their fur still damp with snow, their bodies still trembling but beginning to warm. He realized, in that moment, that he had done something he hadn't even known he was capable of. He had stepped into the storm, facing nature's fury without hesitation, and he had saved these puppies from certain death. As he knelt beside them, his hands gently stroking their fur, Bill felt something stir deep within him. It was the warmth of a connection he had longed for, something that had been missing from his life for so many years. These puppies, small and fragile as they were, had rekindled something inside him that he thought had been lost forever. He smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, there was life, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Bill's hands trembled as he scooped the small puppies into his arms, their tiny bodies ice cold against his chest. He could feel their fragile hearts beating rapidly, their limbs stiff with the cold, and it was clear that time was running out. Each second he spent out in the storm increased the risk that he might lose them. And Bill knew that there was no time to waste. He could feel their desperation, their tiny cries barely audible above the howling wind. And it tore at him. These little creatures, so small, so vulnerable, had placed their trust in him. And he could not fail them. Despite his age, despite the aches and pains that had become all too familiar over the years. Bill did not hesitate. The weight of the puppies, though light, felt heavy in his arms as he stumbled through the snow. But there was no other choice. He gritted his teeth against the biting cold, his breath coming out in ragged bursts. But his mind was clear. There was only one thing that mattered now. And that was getting these puppies to safety. They needed warmth. They needed care. And he was the only one who could provide it. Bill's legs felt like they might give way beneath him. The snow beneath his boots treacherously deep and unrelenting. But he refused to stop. He could feel the sharp sting of the wind against his face. His eyes squinting against the blinding whiteness of the storm. But he kept moving. Each step brought him closer to the cabin, to the warmth that was waiting inside. He focused on that, on the warmth, the shelter, the safety that was just a few more steps away. He could do this. He had to do this. When he finally reached the door of his cabin, his hands were stiff and numb from the cold, but he managed to turn the handle and push the door open. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, enveloping him in its comforting embrace. And for a moment, he stood there, just breathing in the air, feeling the heat seep into his frozen bones. But there was no time to waste. The puppies needed help now. He quickly stepped inside, one by one placing the tiny, shivering creatures onto the floor in front of the fire. The fire was still crackling, the flames dancing and popping as they consumed the wood. But it was far from enough to warm the puppies quickly. Bill moved quickly, his movements sharp and purposeful despite the exhaustion weighing on him. He grabbed a few thick towels from the cupboard, quickly wrapping them around the puppies, creating a soft barrier to keep the warmth in. He didn't know how long it would take for them to thaw. But he knew that he had to act fast. He gently stroked each of them, murmuring soft words of comfort, though he knew they couldn't understand. He just wanted them to feel safe. They were so young, so fragile, and the storm had been a cruel test. He had saved them from the freezing cold, but now it was his responsibility to keep them alive. Bill didn't stop to think about his own fatigue, about the ache in his legs and back from the long trek through the snow. All he could think about was getting the puppies warm again. He grabbed a few blankets from the couch, carefully draping them over the little creatures, making sure they were as comfortable as possible. The heat from the fire was slowly beginning to reach them, and he could see the tiniest signs of life returning to their bodies. Their shivers were less intense now, their breathing steadier, and that was enough to bring a quiet sense of relief to Bill's heart. He turned to his small kitchen and gathered what little he had. A bit of warm milk, some soft food he had left over from his own meals, and a few makeshift bowls. He knew it wasn't much, but it was all he had. He returned to the puppies, gently coaxing them to drink and eat, though most of them were still too weak to respond. Bill didn't mind. He could wait. He would be patient with them. He had waited for so much in his life. This, he knew, was worth waiting for. The hours seemed to stretch on. But slowly, the puppies began to recover. Their breathing became less labored, their tiny bodies less stiff. And soon, they were curling up next to one another, their warmth blending with the heat of the fire. Bill sat beside them, watching over them as they slept. It was quiet now, the storm raging outside but no longer penetrating the safety of the cabin. Bill's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but he refused to rest until he was sure the puppies were all right. The house, though small and modest, had always been enough for him. But now, with these little creatures huddled by the fire, It felt fuller, more alive than it had in years. He knew that his life had changed in that moment. It wasn't just the puppies that had been saved. It was him. too. The quiet and solitude that had defined his existence for so long were no longer enough. He had a purpose again. He had something to care for. Something to protect. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. But inside this cabin, there was warmth, there was life, and there was hope. Bill's eyes drifted over the puppies once more, watching their soft, steady breathing as they slept. He smiled softly, a rare and quiet smile that reached deep into his soul. He had done what he could, and they had survived. The storm outside might have been fierce and unrelenting, but inside, there was peace. There was a sense of fulfillment that Bill hadn't felt in years. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Bill spent the next few hours in quiet solitude, sitting by the fire and watching the puppies slowly regain their strength. Their tiny bodies, once trembling with cold, were now warming up, their eyes starting to open as they adjusted to the comforting heat. He could see them snuggling into each other, their small paws occasionally reaching out to find the warmth of their siblings. Bill couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a tender, peaceful moment, one that filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known in years. He had saved them, given him a chance at life, and now it seemed that they would thrive. Yet, as he sat there, a thought tugged at him. Bill had always loved animals, had always believed in the bond between a mother and her young. He could not shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. Something unfinished. These puppies, so weak and cold when he found them, had to have had a mother. And a mother, Bill knew from his own experiences, would never abandon her children without a grave reason. The instinct to protect and care for one's young was as strong as any force in nature. So why had this mother been separated from her puppies? Why was she not there with them, struggling to protect him from the cold? Just as he had, Bill couldn't let it go. The thought gnawed at him, gnawed at his very heart. He had to find the mother. He had to make sure she was okay. The storm outside was still fierce, but the need to help this mother was stronger than the fear of the storm. It wasn't just about the puppies now. It was about completing the circle. It was about ensuring that the family, however small and fragile, was whole again. He stood up from his chair, the warmth of the fire still comforting him. But it couldn't stop the urgency that was building inside him. The puppies were safe for now. They had been brought back from the brink. But there was still something out there, a mother, alone and lost in the wilderness. Bill knew that if she was still alive, she would need help just as much as her puppies did. And so, without further hesitation, he grabbed his coat and his flashlight, ready to face the storm once more. The night was bitterly cold as Bill stepped back outside. The wind had not relented, and the snow continued to fall in thick sheets, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Bill tightened his grip on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as he moved out into the snow-covered landscape once again. His boots crunched with each step, and his breath puffed out in frosty clouds. But there was no turning back now. He had a mission, a purpose, and nothing would stop him. Bill's search took him through the thick forest behind the cabin, where the trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches heavy with snow. The world was eerily quiet, save for the howling wind and the soft crunch of his footsteps in the snow. Bill called out periodically, hoping for a response, but the storm swallowed up his voice, leaving only the sound of nature's fury. The search was exhausting, and as time passed, Bill began to wonder if he would ever find her. The cold began to seep into his bones, and his legs grew heavy with fatigue. But his resolve never wavered. He had to keep going. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, when Bill was beginning to lose hope, that he saw a movement in the snow. At first, it was just a blur. But as he drew closer, he realized that it was a dog, weak, stumbling, and dragging itself through the snow. Bill's heart leapt as he recognized her. It was the mother, the golden retriever who had given birth to the puppies he had saved. She was thin, exhausted, and covered in snow, her fur matted and stiff from the freezing cold. Bill could see the signs of desperation in her eyes. The same fear that had been in the puppies when he had found them. She had been struggling to survive. And now, finally, she was here. Without a moment's hesitation, Bill rushed to her side, his heart full of compassion for the suffering animal. She was so weak, so frail, that she could barely stand on her own. But she managed to lift her head and look at him with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. Bill gently reached down, his hands trembling as he scooped her up into his arms, careful not to hurt her. She was cold to the touch, her body trembling with the effects of the storm. But she responded to his touch with a soft whine, as if thanking him for his kindness. Bill didn't waste any time. He carefully carried the mother back to the cabin, his heart racing with relief as he moved through the snow. The storm seemed to grow worse with every step, but he focused on the warmth that awaited them both inside. When Bill finally reached the door of the cabin, he pushed it open and stepped inside, the warmth of the fire instantly wrapping around them like a blanket. He gently set the mother down near the fire, just as he had done with her puppies earlier. The heat was a stark contrast to the biting cold of the storm. And Bill could see her breathing become steadier as she began to thaw. Her eyes closed for a moment as she rested, her body still weak but no longer as frail. Bill quickly fetched a bowl of warm milk and some food, offering it to her, though she was too tired to eat at first. But after a few moments, she began to lap at the food and drink, her strength slowly returning. Bill sat beside her, his heart swelling with a sense of peace. The family, though still small, was whole again. The mother had been found. And now, she was safe. She looked up at him with soft, grateful eyes, and Bill felt a deep connection to her. In that moment, he realized that the bond between them was not just one of kindness and care. It was a bond of survival, of shared hope in the face of adversity. The storm might have raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, there was love, and there was life. And for the first time in a long time, Bill didn't feel alone anymore. As the days passed, the warmth of the cabin became a sanctuary for both Bill and the dogs. The storm had subsided, and the snow outside, although still thick, no longer held the same oppressive weight. The air inside the cabin was warm, filled with the gentle crackle of the fire, and a sense of peace settled over the small space. The puppies, once so weak and frail, were now lively, their energy returning with each passing hour. They ran around the room, chasing after one another, tumbling over the rugs, their joyful yelps filling the cabin with a sound Bill hadn't heard in years. The mother, too, had made remarkable progress, though still a little tired. She had regained much of her strength. Her coat, once matted with snow and dirt, was now clean and soft, and her eyes sparkled with a renewed sense of vitality. She kept a watchful eye on her puppies, nudging him gently with her nose as they played, and occasionally curling up beside him to rest. Bill couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a sight that filled his heart with a deep sense of satisfaction and happiness. He had done more than just save them from the storm. He had brought them together, given them the warmth and care they needed to thrive. Each day, Bill made sure to tend to their needs, providing food and water, and ensuring they were comfortable. But he also spent time simply being with them, sitting on his chair by the fire, watching as the puppies scampered around the cabin, their little bodies full of life and wonder. The mother would often rest her head on Bill's knee, looking up at him with gratitude in her eyes. It was as if she understood that he had given her back what she had lost, her puppies, her family, her chance at life. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. In the mornings, Bill would open the door, and the puppies would rush outside, tumbling over one another in their excitement. They hadn't quite learned the art of running in the snow yet, but they were eager to explore their new world. The mother, always close by, would watch over them, making sure they stayed safe. Bill would follow him out, sometimes sitting in a chair on the porch, his eyes following their every move as they sniffed the air and pounced on the snow, their tails wagging in excitement. It wasn't long before Bill realized that he had come to care for these dogs more than he had ever anticipated. He had always been a lover of animals, but something about this little family, this unexpected bond, had touched his heart in ways he couldn't explain. They had brought joy back into his life, filling the empty spaces that had lingered for so long. By the time the weather began to warm, the puppies were no longer the fragile, shivering creatures Bill had found in the storm. They were strong, healthy, and full of life. They had grown in size, their coats thickening as they reached the age where they were ready to explore more of the world outside. Bill would watch them with pride, knowing that they had been given a second chance. Just as he had, they had formed a family in the cabin, a family that had come together in the most unlikely of circumstances. And for Bill, it was a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, there could be warmth, love, and life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside was blanketed in soft twilight, Bill sat by the fire, his worn hands resting on his knees. The puppies, now grown into playful young dogs, were curled up at his feet, their bodies warm against the cool evening air. The mother lay beside him, her head resting on the arm of his chair, her eyes half closed in contentment. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling fire, and in that quiet, Bill felt a peace he had not known in many years. He had spent so much of his life in solitude, and for the longest time, he had accepted it, but now, with the dogs by his side, he realized that he wasn't truly alone anymore. They had become his family in every sense of the word. The love they shared, the care they had for one another, was a testament to the bond that had formed between them. Bill looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the dogs, the warmth of the fire reflecting in their eyes. It was a simple life, but it was a full one. He had a sense of purpose now, a reason to wake up each morning, and that reason was sitting right beside him, curled up on the floor, content and safe. The quiet moments they shared, when the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft breaths of the puppies, were moments of pure happiness. Moments that Bill would cherish for as long as he lived. He thought back to the night he had found the puppies in the snow. The night he had ventured out into the storm without a second thought, driven by a sense of compassion he hadn't felt in years. He remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming feeling that he might fail them. But now, looking at the family he had helped rebuild, Bill knew that he had done the right thing. He had given him life. He had given him love. And in return, they had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a family. As the night grew darker and the fire flickered low, Bill settled back into his chair, his eyes closing for a moment. Content. The puppies, now grown and full of energy, were quiet for the moment, resting at his feet, the warmth of the fire keeping him close. The mother lay beside him, her body relaxed, trusting. Bill smiled softly, his heart full, as the happiness and warmth in the cabin filled every corner of his being. This was his family now, this small, faithful group, and he knew that, no matter what the future held, they would always have each other. And in that simple truth, Bill found a peace he hadn't known he was looking for. The storm had passed, and in its wake, he had found something truly priceless. the warmth of love, the joy of companionship, and the comfort of knowing that he was no longer alone.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.